Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today we're going to continue along the legacy revised history of San Francisco and the state of California, the Golden State. The state where we had the gold rush, which was a psychological operation, people. Yes, it was. Was there gold in California? Yeah, there was. There is. I mean, I know people personally who have found pebbles in the American River and some of the tributaries. I know that, and they still pan for gold up in the Auburn Ravine to this day. But you're not going to get rich doing that. I also know there's a lot of streams that you should never drink out of because they are laced with cyanide poisoning that was used to leach out the minerals in the hillsides. So there's a lot of pollution that went on in the California hills in order to find tin or gold. But the big money was in Nevada, in Virginia City, the Comstock Lode, which created the Silver Legacy, and Reno as the littlest big city in America. That was silver, and that was the Sutro family, which had relationships with the who's who of San Francisco, which would include the William Randolph Hearst family, of course, amongst many other Scion landowners and corporate owners. Now, remember, people, what we were taught in school, which of course was poppycock, as we now know, is that there were three branches of government in our so-called democratic republic. We never had a democracy. No one ever said we did. We had a democratic republic, which was founded on the principles of provincial rights, states' rights, that there would be a zip code large enough to be able to better represent the people that lived within the borders of a state. And then those states would have representatives, and they would be sent to a federal authority known as the House of Representatives. They would be congressmen, primarily, House of Representatives. And then to represent the nobility class, which of course are the wealthy people that own most of the land in the various states of the nation, we created this thing called the Senate. And so this is a legislative body of government. It's the combination of the nobility, which is called the Senate, and then the commoners, which is represented in the House of Representatives. And when you combined the nobility class, which has 100 senators, 2 from each state, with the House of Representatives, which I don't know what they have, 478 Congress people, you combine them together and you call it the Congress, which passes laws, introduces legislation, which of course subtract your freedoms, right? Because any law that is ever enacted does nothing to increase your freedom. It only subtracts whatever freedom that you already had. So the whole idea of having a nation of laws is sort of an oxymoron. What it means is you're a nation of mandates. And the fewer laws you have, the more freedom you'll have. It's a inverse relationship. So if you really want freedom, you want to do away with the Congress of the United States, okay? All right, then we had what was called the executive branch of government. And this is where you have the president, and he has his finger on the nuclear switch button, right? And then he's backed up with the vice president, and then we have the Secretary of State, who's in charge of all the clandestine services offices at U.S. embassies throughout the world. There's hundreds of those. And we call him the Secretary of State as if he's in the diplomacy business, which he's not. He's just a part of the CIA housing projects. He provides provisional homes and offices for CIA operatives throughout the world. And I mean the whole world. And we have the head of the FBI, who's sort of a clown figure with a big red nose, whoever that might be. I mean, for decades, that was a transhuman cross-dresser by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. That's who ran the FBI and lived with his mommy until he was about 42 years old. And then he had his gay lover, Clyde Tolston, on the payroll of the FBI. So no one should be proud of the FBI. I mean, it was established by a cross-dresser who lived with his mother, who put his lover on the payroll, who became the director of the FBI, I think for a whole day. For one whole day, Clyde Tolston was the director of FBI. Yeah. So it's a joke. It's always been a joke. I used to watch the TV show Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. starring in the FBI. What a joke. That has nothing whatsoever to do with the reality of the FBI. And I was even recruited to work for the FBI when I was in my senior year of university, and I am so glad I passed that up. So anyway, it's hard to stay serious. Then we had what's called the judicial branch of government. We have the Supreme Court, right? And they rule over states that can't decide on what the law is, as if anyone wants a centralized power figure telling you what is and isn't legal. That's sort of a violation of states' rights, right? So right out of the gate, you have this thing called the Supreme Court, which is political appointment positions, basically. You have to be appointed to the court. So the whole thing is gerrymandered and rigged from the get-go. And I think it's a total insult that you would say that you had a democratic republic, but you have a Supreme Court that's a centralized authority. I mean, those are incompatible. You can't have a Supreme Court and then have lesser courts amongst the states. I mean, if anything, the state Supreme Courts are superior to the United States Supreme Court, which would be not even necessary. There's no reason to have a Supreme Court, in my opinion. Anything to do with centralized authority is repugnant to me and should be repugnant to you. I mean, you can see where we're going with the central bank digital currency. That is a centralized authority over your social obedience participation score, because your obedience will be directly related to your participation score. So the less obedient you are, the more you will be disenfranchised and you will have no purchasing power. It could be turned off to zero. So that's how I view the Supreme Court of the United States, is that they're sort of a banking authority to say that you're a bad person. So I'm opposed to a centralized judicial branch. I am opposed to centralized banking. I'm opposed to centralized authority. It's repugnant, and it's, of course, flies in the face of anything called a democratic republic. Anyway, we've never had one, and we don't have one today. So what else is new, right? So today I'm going to talk about some figures that you may not have heard of. I'm going to talk about Robert Graysmith. Robert Graysmith is a CIA fake book author. That's what I'm going to call him, because that's really what he is. Before Robert Greystone worked at the San Francisco Chronicle as a cartoonist, he's a cartoonist that learned to write. In 1969, before Robert Greystone started writing CIA books, he was a cartoonist. And Kurt Gentry was a San Francisco CIA author. Kurt Gentry wrote Overflight, which was the cover-up fake story of Francis Gary Powers when he was positioned near Moscow on May 1st, 1960, and landed safely in a farm field. And then Kurt Gentry wrote a book about how the evil Russians shot him out of the sky with a surface-to-air missile, which never happened, okay? And then the guy has over a dozen pieces of personal identification under his seat cushion, which could never happen if it was a follow standard operating procedures, where spy pilots carry no personal identification with them ever. Ever. I mean, not on a mission. They can carry it when they're buying groceries at the local store, but they don't take it with them when they go up in the air. All right, unless they're supposed to. In other words, unless the CIA wants that identification to be discovered on purpose, deliberately. That's the only way things can happen. That's how people get whacked, too. They don't just get whacked. They have to be sanctioned, authorized, and a bank has to provide, private monies to sponsor the hit, the sanction. Even Clint Eastwood did a film on it called The Iger Sanction, where you murder people that the clandestine services want terminated, but you do it on the side of the Iger, a steep mountain climbing cliff, to create the illusion that there was an accident, that it was an accidental death when it's a sanctioned hit, the Iger sanction. It's what they do with everything. It's what they do with Bill Holden, right? He's a drunkard in a stupor, and he hits his head on something we don't know what it was, like a baseball bat or a crowbar. There's no murder weapon found, and there's no blood on any teak table edge. So it's just sort of a mystery, right? No, it's a murder. It's a homicide, okay? And then you find Thomas Albert Decker with a ball gag in his mouth, with a blindfold around his head, and handcuffed in his bathtub, naked, with red lipstick profanity written all over his body, with two syringes, a syringe in each arm, with his garroted with a rope that's tied to the shower curtain, and then that's ruled a suicide. Obviously. Same situation with Robin Williams in Tiburon. Garroted, suicide, right? Same situation with Anthony Bourdain in France. Suicide, right? Was JonBenet Ramsey a suicide? She was killed exactly the same way that Anthony Bourdain and Robin Williams were. Did she commit suicide at age 6? I don't think so. I don't think so. Is her father work for the CIA? Yeah, he did. Executive Vice President for Lockheed. All right, so we're going to also talk about Don Cheney. We're going to talk about Arthur Lee Allen. We're going to talk about the Pelosis living in Presidio Heights and Sharon Tate's father living there too. I mean, he lived technically in the Presidio Army Base officer housing, but that is very close to the Presidio Heights neighborhood, which is in close proximity to the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which is a CI operation. That's where Timothy Leary was working. That's where Hunter S. Thompson was working. That's where Louis Jolyon West, a medical doctor, CIA MK Ultra psychiatrist, was working. That's where Jim Jones was working. That is where Bill Graham, aka Wolf Grajonka, was working to do his free concerts, making money. How, I don't know. Someone must be paying him, right? Private banker, maybe. That's where Ines Mejia was working. Speaking of private bankers, that's Abigail Folger's mother, right? She has a senior position in the Presidio Heights area, and she lives in Pacific Heights. I want you to know that there's a distinction between Pacific Heights and Pacific Avenue and Broadway. The media lately wants you to focus on Broadway because that's where the Sacred Heart Order Convent is located, which is an indoctrination center for young children. That's at 2222 Broadway. And the Paul Pelosi hammer we can't find, the infamous invisible hammer, that was at 2640 Broadway. So that's 4 blocks up the road from the Catholic Sacred Heart Order Convent. 4 blocks up the road. By the way, that is not where Paul Pelosi or Nancy Pelosi resides. They don't live there. There's no view of the San Francisco Bay. There's no view of the Golden Gate Bridge. You can't see Belvedere. You can't see Alcatraz, which is where you belong. You can't see Angel Island or Tiburon from 2640. So guess what? They're remodeling the house that they live on, which is 5 blocks to the east, up a block, at the tippy top. See, Broadway's not at the tippy top of Pacific Heights. The tippy top is Pacific Avenue. So all the homes on Pacific Avenue, generally speaking, are going to be, another 10, 15% more expensive because they're the highest place in that zip code, Pacific Avenue. And that is where the Pelosis have 4 garages, which they need because Paul Pelosi keeps wrecking his Porsche Carrera sports cars. So he's got to have backup cars. You can only drive 1 car at a time, but if you keep crashing them, you're going to need a dozen cars. So I suppose every time he wrecks a car, they have to purchase a new car. And you need a garage facility for that. So they have one on Pacific Avenue. They only have a 1-car garage at the 2640 Broadway. So that's a fake you out house. I think it's for CIA poker games myself personally. But it's certainly not for any so-called fake hammer attacks, except to stage it, to just say, hey, this is what happened. But if you listen to the San Francisco police chief, Bill Scott, you will learn absolutely nothing about the truth. I mean, I don't think Bill Scott has the foggiest idea what happened at all. And he's reading his script, right? Just like Brooke Jenkins, who's the fake district attorney, you know, who I think's maybe 32 years old. She might be 29 years old. She has no birthday. And she supposedly went to Hastings Law School, you know, down there by the Wolf Grajonka Civic Auditorium, which they mistakenly named Bill Graham Civic Auditorium, right across from where George Moscone and Harvey Milk, you know, had their heads blown off, where Nancy Pelosi celebrates weddings. Yeah, at a murder scene. Sort of like Oliver Silverstein going and giving a get well card to Timothy Leary at the Abigail Folger murder scene on Cielo Drive, which is really Bella, and Oliver Stone parked on Sunbrook Drive, which is 30 seconds down the ice plant from where Abigail was bayoneted 28 times and bled out on the lawn. So that's kind of a cult ritual, obedience exercise to see if Oliver Stone will go over to visit a lifetime CIA operative, Timothy Leary, on St. Patrick's Day. So you have Oliver Silverstein going over to say hello to Timothy Leary in his last 2 months of his life. You know, in March 1996, true story, there's Oliver Stone at the murder scene for Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger. There he is. That's cult ritual. That's exactly the same as Gordon Getty's granddaughter getting married on the steps below where Harvey Milk had his head blown off. Right? And that is the story of Dianne Feinstein, because you wouldn't know who Dianne Feinstein, whose name is Goldman. That's not her real name either. But anyway, her grandfather changed it to Goldman from something else. So the point is, nobody knows. Nobody is who you think they are, not one person. Dianne Feinstein had 3 husbands, and it's all very confusing. So the point is that you wouldn't know who Dianne Feinstein was. Age 89, Senator of the United States of America. Are you kidding me? What business would hire an 89-year-old person? Could you drive a bus? Could you deliver the mail? Could you work at a Subway sandwich shop at age 89? Could you? I double and triple dare you. I don't think so. But you can be a United States Senator if I can control you in your lifetime CIA. That's the only way you could be age 82, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. That's the only way you could be Dianne Feinstein, a senator from California, at age 89. Maybe going to retire soon. Well, you think? I mean, why bother? I mean, you're just going to die in office, right? I mean, that's what happened to George Moscone. That's how you got your job as mayor of San Francisco. If George Moscone hadn't have been assassinated, allegedly, by Dan White, I don't know if he did it or not. Dan White is a Manchurian candidate. 6 years United States Army, 1.5 years in Vietnam. You know he was seeing a psychologist. Hell, he got thrown out of high school for violence in his junior year. Then he was valedictorian of his class. So that's the perfect CIA stooge. A guy who's violent, who's super smart, who spends 6 years in the United States Army, goes to Vietnam, comes back, and blows the brains out of the mayor of San Francisco so that Dianne Feinstein can become a politically knowledgeable person in television, in media. All right, so that's what we're dealing with here, people. And so I drilled into what was going on in San Francisco in 1969, and I think we realized that Dianne Feinstein was 36 years old at that time, and Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi were 29 years old. They had just arrived. They had been in New York City beginning their lives, and they had 2 children, and then they had Paul Pelosi Jr., I think's the 3rd child, and he is 9 months old on October 11th, 1969. And I believe the Pelosi's were there then because, see, Ines Mejia, her daughter Abigail Folger, was bayoneted 28 times and murdered on August 9th, 1969. That kind of neutralized Ines Mejia as being the boss lady, private banker for the CIA operations at Haight Ashbury. So you got to sort of shunt her aside and install a new private banker, which I'm thinking could be Paul Pelosi Sr., who would have been 29 years old. He's perfect. He's Jesuit educated. He went to St. Ignatius High School. He knows the neighborhood. He went to Georgetown, Jesuit. He's married to Nancy Pelosi, whose father was a corrupt United States congressman affiliated with the mafia. So you have the perfect, power team. It's like Bill and Hillary Clinton of the West, Paul and Nancy Pelosi. And you plug them in right when you retire Abigail Folger's mother, Inés Mejia, with El Salvador ambassador status, and you shunt her aside, and then you install the new replacement. And I don't know who the new replacement is. I just find it a heck of a coincidence that the Pelosi's arrived back to San Francisco, or Nancy was the first time she'd been to San Francisco, because she was from Maryland. She was from Baltimore, Maryland. And so San Francisco is a new home for Nancy Pelosi in 1969. But it's old home week for Paul Pelosi. And there he is. And they move into Presidio Heights, which is next door to the Army base, and Sharon Tate's father, Paul Tate. And they're all there at the same time when Paul Stein, the yellow cab taxi driver, is murdered at the corner of Washington Street and Cherry Street in Presidio Heights. Walking distance to the Pelosi home, walking distance to Paul Tate's officer housing, which is inside the Army base, but very close. And I mean very close. So, what a coincidence. Except when you realize, looking back now, it's not a coincidence at all. And then you have this cartoonist who's working at the DeYoung brothers owned and controlled Chronicle newspapers. I personally know a lot about the Chronicle because that was the morning edition. They also had the Examiner, which was owned by the William Randolph Hearst empire. So you should know that the before television, afternoon delivery newspapers had higher circulation and higher profits than did the morning editions before television. And then that started to change in the 50s. And then it became kind of a 50-50 split. And then I think it kicked over to the morning edition. Chronicle had higher circulation, I believe, than the afternoon Examiner. So you didn't really need an afternoon newspaper when you could turn on Walter Cronkite and CBS Evening News, and he could lie to you, right? Because that's what those newspapers are about, poppycock. They're lying to you. That's what you learned in the newspapers. Sonny Barger said to me personally, I'll never forget, said this around 1977 or 78. He had just got out of prison for a short stay. It wasn't a very long stay, but they then had his federal gun charges dropped shortly after. Around the time I was talking to him, he was having that deleted. Guns that were found in his garage that belonged to his girlfriend is what the defense was, and they bought that. So they didn't charge the girlfriend, who was a beauty queen from Livermore, California, out by the Lawrence Livermore Weapons Lab. Yes, she was. Anyway, Sonny Barger, who was the president of the Alameda County Hells Angels, told me when I asked him, did he work for free beer, $500 worth of beer at Altamont Speedway for the Altamont free concert in December 6, 1969, and he looked right at me and he knew my name, and he called my name, and he said, do you think that I would work for free beer? And I said, no, I don't think so. He says, then he says my name again. He says, don't believe anything you read in the newspapers. That's coming out of Sonny Barger in, let's say, 1978, early 1978. He tells me, don't believe anything I read in the newspapers. And I was a paper boy, or had been a paper boy. I wasn't a paper boy when he told me this. But it's the same with television, because television then took over from newspapers and radio. And then today it's with your stupid cell phone, right? So your cell phone gives you all the fake news. It's the same thing as television, radio, newspapers, poppycock. Anyway, this Robert Greystone is a cartoonist, and in 1969 when the Zodiac killing happens. Now, of course, Robert Greystone has been associated with the film Autofocus with Bob Crane, the murder of Bob Crane, the actor from Hogan's Heroes. He was Colonel Hogan, which also starred Richard Dawson, who was a corporal. He was a corporal in the Navy, Royal Army, and his trying to think of his status, his character. Anyway, I forgot. It doesn't matter. What I should tell you is that what I want to say is this Robert Greystone is working for the DeYoungs, but he's not really working for the DeYoungs. He's working for the CIA, is who he's working for. Because CIA runs San Francisco, and they run all the newspapers in the whole world. And they run William Randolph Hearst, too. So you can't be a cartoonist or have a column in the San Francisco Chronicle or Examiner and write whatever you want. I know that for a fact because I went to lunch and I bought lunch for a Harvard-educated woman who had her own column in the San Francisco Chronicle, and she wanted to write a story about doping in cycling specifically. So I asked her at Tommy Toy's restaurant right at the Transamerica Pyramid, why don't you do a doping story about NFL football or college football or high school football? Why don't you do a doping story on Major League Baseball? Why don't you do a doping story on NBA basketball? Why don't you do a doping story on track and field or badminton, Olympic badminton? And she smiled and laughed. She goes, oh, I couldn't do that. I said, yeah, because ESPN would cancel your contracts because you say goodbye to your advertising. You can't do truthful stories when it affects the income of your newspaper. That's called financial engineering. That's called paid sophistry. And that's really what I told her she was engaging in. And I said, you're going after Lance Armstrong, who for sure is doped. Of course he is, as is everybody in his sport, everybody on his team. But I said, why don't you pick on a bigger sport with more money? Oh, you'll get crushed. That's why. You can pick on cycling because it's a very small boutique thing, right? But the point is, they're all doped, okay? All of them, 100%. Or else you won't see them on television. If you see them on television, they're compromised and controlled. That's why they're so arrogant, and that is why they're so confident, because they're backed up by big corporations and the clandestine services who stands behind their lies, their sophistry, their applied linguistics. But you should know that the William Randolph Hearst thing, we could spend weeks talking about the machinations of the yellow journalism and Remember the Maine and the Spanish-American War and propaganda and foreign what do you call them? Correspondents. You don't call them journalists. They're foreign correspondents when they're in another country. And the monarch of the dailies with the Hearst eagle atop the San Francisco Examiner. But you should know that in 1969, the Hearst Foundation papers entered into a non-compete covenant agreement with the DeYoung brothers in San Francisco so that they wouldn't try to bash each other over the head with the Zodiac stories and the shenanigans that were going on in the CIA-controlled Haight-Ashbury. Because remember, we had Timothy Leary there, we had Bill Graham there, we had Hunter S. Thompson, gonzo journalist there, we had the Hells Angels distributing drugs. We had a lot of inappropriate, criminal, felonious activity when Joseph Alioto was the mayor of San Francisco, and Dianne Feinstein was getting ready to become famous. And trying to find this particular wording that I'm looking for. It's a military acronym that William Randolph Hearst and the DeYoung brothers followed. You should know that the Examiner initially started in 1863, and it was called the Democratic Press, which was pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery, pro-Democratic Party, right? That's why you should never trust a Democrat. They're for slavery. Today they're for techno-enslavement and mandates. That's the Democratic Party. They're pro-slavery, which today is techno-enslavery. They're pro-Confederacy, which, hey, I'm for Confederacy too, so that's all right. I'm for people making their own decisions in a small zip code area. I'm for local government. The Democratic Party was also opposed to Abraham Lincoln, who you may remember was actually a Republican. So that was how the Examiner started out, but it was purchased by the Hearst family in 1880. and by George Hearst, who made a boatload of money with the silver mining up in Nevada, working with the Sutro family. And then he got bored of it, and he turned it over to William Randolph Hearst, who, at age 23. And then that William Randolph Hearst went on to create the Spanish-American War in 1897. Remember the Maine, and all. His words were quoted as saying, getting telegraphs back from his correspondents in Havana, Cuba. Nothing's going on here. And William Randolph Hearst was attributed to have said, "You provide the photos, I'll provide the war." Yellow journalism, aka war propaganda, something that Walt and Roy Disney would know something about. William Randolph Hearst hired Sam Chamberlain to help him, ignite the whole foreign propaganda business. Examples are specifically the Spanish-American War in 1897, and then, of course, which that was a war that I think lasted 4.5 months. And then we had the annexation of the Philippines in 1898. Like, as soon as the Spanish War terminated, then we had the Philippines, and he's providing the propaganda that Americans believe is the truth. But it's not the truth. It's just what is available for you to call information. It's disinformation. All right, so there's an agreement that they entered into in 1965, and here it is. In 1965, the Hearst Corporation began pursuing joint operating agreements. In other words, they did this in all cities. The acronym is called JOA, plural, JOAs, Joint Operating Agreements. That means that you do the morning propaganda and I'll do the afternoon propaganda, and it'll be copy and pasted. And then they hire one company to do the printing of both papers. So the papers are technically owned by different families, but they're printed and distributed by a centralized authority. That's what's the important part. In San Francisco, it was called the San Francisco Newspaper Agencies. That's who published the Chronicle in the morning and the Examiner in the afternoon. That's the same setup in Los Angeles, and I'm assuming that's the same setup that you do in Chicago and New York, is that you have a centralized printing distribution authority. Today, I don't know how it works today. I mean, most people don't read newspapers anymore, and so who cares, right? Anyway, I just wanted you to know that they were doing this joint operating agreement in San Francisco in 1965. That is when Timothy Leary arrived in San Francisco. That was when Abigail Folger's mother was working in Haight, Ashbury in 1965. I believe she was working there before that. And she certainly worked in there up until when her daughter was killed and murdered in August 1969. But that is also when Jim Jones came to San Francisco, was when the Hearst Corporation pursued joint operating agreements. So you got Jim Jones to town. That's when Bill Graham from New York City came to town. That is when Hunter S. Thompson came to town in 1965. That is when Timothy Leary is in town. Ken Kesey rolls in the next year. That's not a coincidence. That's a CIA operation. In 1972-73, Harvey Milk, a Lithuanian Jew, rolls in from New York to San Francisco. Previously, he'd been to California when he was less than honorably discharged from the United States Navy, Harvey Milk, due to homosexuality. Then he comes to San Francisco for the Castro operation, and he gets his head blown off within 4.5 years of being in San Francisco. I mean, it was real quick. Harvey Milk's effect in San Francisco was minimal. I mean, Jim Jones spent more time in San Francisco than Harvey Milk did, and they didn't really do a film on Jim Jones, have they? Why don't they do a movie on Jim Jones? He had a 10-year relationship, minimum 10-year relationship with the city by the bay. Harvey Milk had a 4-year to 4.5-year relationship, right? But see, that's how history works. They emphasize certain people, they delete other people. And you couldn't have Jonestown unless you had People's Temple. That would involve Dianne Feinstein. That would involve George Moscone. That would involve Joe Alioto. That would involve John Burton. That would involve Philip Burton, who I believe was a United States congressman, who Nancy Pelosi eventually took over his place. Philip Burton. And John Burton was a California state assemblyman and the mentor of Willie Brown, who became mayor of San Francisco and went to Hastings Law School, where Kamala Harris went, next to the Wolf Grudjanka Civic Auditorium, which was built during the first World's Fair exhibition. So Robert Greystone became interested in the Zodiac case after October 11, 1969, because he was working at the Chronicle as a cartoonist. That's the story. Anyway, I'm not buying the story, of course, right? Since then, Robert Graysmith has written an enormous amount of books that you can buy on Amazon, right? And they're all fake books. Every single one is a fake book. And what it does is connects a bunch of dots of murders that I didn't know were CIA that I think now are CIA. You can tell because, see, Kurt Gentry wrote the book on a CIA operation involving Lockheed and Gary Powers. And they tell a lie that he got shot out of the sky. It's a total mendacity. He landed the plane safely all by himself. Then Gary Powers gets murdered in a helicopter crash by his helicopter exploding over Van Nuys, the Sepulveda Reservoir Recreation Center. And they don't have a book on that. So they deleted the murder of Francis Gary Powers. They don't have a book about his murder. They have a book about his fake shootdown. And it was written by Kurt Gentry. Then Kurt Gentry goes on to write a book on the USS Pueblo, which is a Navy intelligence CIA operation spying on North Korea. And he writes a Poppycock book about second in command, because the commander had his head conked. So second in command had to take over. All the men were imprisoned. And they were released. This is the year that we had the My Lai massacre, 1968, which is another CIA Phoenix operation. I don't see a book on that. Why don't we have a book on Operation Phoenix? Don't do that. Why is that? Then Kurt Gentry writes the Charlie Manson mendacity book, Helter Skelter, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the murder of Sharon Tate or Abigail Folger or Lena LaBianca. Nothing. Zero. Nada. Nothing. But there it is, and he got paid to write that book. And then they say, oh, Vincent Bugliosi wrote the book. No, he didn't. He was the fifth banana in the trial. I mean, he's like not even an important person. Plus, he's busy defending himself against his milkman because he was stalking his milkman for like 4 years and had to pay his milkman $15,000 in $100 bills. All right, so Vincent Bugliosi doesn't have time to write a book. Plus, he mentally doesn't have the acuity to be able to write a book. But Kurt Gentry does. And guess who took over from Kurt Gentry? Robert Graysmith, because he wrote all of these books. I'm just going to mention a few of the Robert Greystone books. Holy Toledo, it's quite a list. I didn't know he was so busy. All right, so he's mostly done Zodiac books. Shooting Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. The Murder of Bob Crane by Robert Graysmith. Zodiac Unmasked, The Identity of by Robert Graysmith. Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. Zodiac, The Shocking True Story of the... Oh boy. Zodiac, The Shocking True Story of the Hunt for the Nation's Most Elusive Serial Killer. God, you know what? The Zodiac case is not that complicated, people. It's not that complicated. It really isn't. Okay? The Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger is not that complicated. See, if you knew what Benedict Canyon was for, and if you knew Psychops, and you knew what the Presidio was for, and the Presidio Heights neighborhood was for, and the Haight Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was for, and what Sharon Tate's father did for a living, and what Abigail Folger's mother did for a living, and what Leno LaBianca did for a living, and that he inherited his parents' business and turned it into a money laundering private banking facility, if you knew that, you'd understand what happened. And Charlie Scott, that's his name, Charlie Manson's father's name is Colonel Walker Scott. And no, he wasn't in the Army. His name is Colonel, nothing to do with military. His father's name is Colonel Walker Scott. I said Scott. But then his 15, 16-year-old mother married another man who became Charles Scott's stepfather, and then he assumed the name of Manson, which is coordinates to CBS Evil Masonic Eye, because they had a corporation called Mason International, which is their foyer into the porn industry. And that's how Charlie Manson got his name. So he's kind of a CBS-controlled clandestine soldier that got thrown under the bus to be the fake serial killer who never killed anybody. And they dragged Ronald Reagan into the Charlie Manson mendacity too, right? Because that's what they do. That's what they do. So Autofocus is a film that was produced by a book that Robert Graysmith wrote. And you should know that Bob Crane, who was born on July 13th, 1928 in Connecticut, in Waterbury, Connecticut, was murdered at age 49 in Scottsdale, Arizona. And he was hit over the head multiple times with, I believe, the tripod for the cameras that they did the pornographic nude sex scenes with his ladies that he would lure back to his apartment. And it kind of looks like this John Carpenter killed him, who was his kind of partner who handled the video equipment, and they were breaking up as a team. And so it's alleged that that John Carpenter became angry. He got on a plane on June 25th and flew to Arizona to have it out with Bob Crane, and and then murdered him with the tripod, and then jumped on a plane, returned his rental car, and went back to San Diego. So that definitely is motive, means, and opportunity, right? And you'll notice with William Shatner and his third wife, Noreen, William Shatner had motive, means, and opportunity also. And you should notice that Charlie Manson and Charles Watson had no means, no motive, and no opportunity. But they got convicted anyway. So just because I say motive, means, and opportunity doesn't mean that you can't be convicted in a court in the so-called United States of America. Because they can indict a ham sandwich and they can convict you of first-degree murder, even if you're innocent. It's not a problem. Especially if I plant evidence and I destroy other evidence and I don't listen to your alibi and you don't get to present a defense and I own the judge and I maneuver the jury exactly where I have. If you don't believe me, why don't you study the O.J. Simpson case and tell me what an excellent example of jurisprudence that was, right? That trial was surrounded by CIA people. When you have the son of a CIA director as a material witness in the case, that's a red flag. When you have F. Lee Bailey, who's a career CIA lawyer, representing the defendant, that is a red flag. When you have another CIA hoaxer from Yale Law School, so-called Harvard lecturer, Alan Dershowitz, flapping away his lips on television every day, when he was never actually involved in the trial at all, but he was very involved with the social engineering of how to perceive, the case, that's a red flag. When you have the defendant, O.J. Simpson, getting Navy SEAL training on how to slit people's throats just weeks before his ex-wife gets murdered, that's a red flag. You notice that wasn't introduced in the trial. That's not evidence. That's not evidence. Okay. I see. I get it. Anyway, Robert Greystone was married twice. Political cartoonist for the San Francisco Chronicle when the Paul Stein murder happened in Nancy Pelosi's neighborhood. And not much is known really too much about Robert Greystone, but it is very clear based on the books that he's allegedly authored. I don't know if he wrote the books or not. I mean, I'm not sure if Kurt Gentry wrote his books either, because it's easy to just put your name on somebody else's work. So who knows? But anyway, My point is that the books that Robert Graysmith is associated with are mostly CIA operations, and not all. I'm not saying 100%, but the majority are. And I never thought the Zodiac case had anything to do with the CIA. I thought it had to do with Don Cheney, who lived in Concord and was a life insurance salesman. I thought it had to do with Arthur Lee Allen, who was a loser who lived with his mother in the basement downstairs unit and had a lot of guns and a lot of knives and a lot of bayonets and also had machetes. He was a creepy, strange person that didn't date. He was awkward. There were a lot of issues I'm not going to get into with him. And I thought that, since the murders happened within 1 to 2 miles of where he lived, and that Don Cheney is fairly close by, he's a 20-minute drive away, that those two together as a team could conduct the murders, which the first 2 murders of a 16 and 17-year-old, they were not associated with Zodiac in any way at all. It wasn't until 7 months later on the 4th of July that the word Zodiac was injected into the story. So you already had 2 people that were murdered that had no association with anything to do with Zodiac. But what the point about Robert Graysmith is that in all of his books on Zodiac, he's completely missed the point that in 1939, on September 8th, 1939, Charlie Chan in Treasure Island, that film with Cesar Romero, who played a psychologist, told you that there's a killer loose in San Francisco killing in wealthy neighborhoods named the Zodiac Killer. So Hollywood already told you that there's a Zodiac loose in Presidio Heights or Pacific Heights. I mean, it would either be Seacliff, Pacific Heights, or Presidio Heights. Those are the 3 upscale neighborhoods of San Francisco in 1969. And do you know that that at 10 p.m. at night on October 11th, 1969, when Robert Graysmith is a cartoonist at the Chronicle, and when Nancy and Paul Pelosi are living in Presidio Heights, that Paul Stein, age 29, the same age as Nancy Pelosi, the same age as Paul Pelosi, could be a message to them. He gets shot, I guess, in his right temple with a 9mm pistol. 1 shot only, very professional, and the killer calmly walked into the Presidio Army base. It's about a 2.5 block walk. What you should know is that was 30 years and 33 days after the release of Charlie Chan in Treasure Island, where they told you a Zodiac killer is operating in wealthy neighborhoods. Presidio Heights is a wealthy neighborhood. You have to be wealthy to get in there. So obviously somebody helped Paul Pelosi and Nancy Pelosi become ensconced in Presidio Heights. And no sooner did they move in that we had the final Zodiac killing. And this guy, Robert Graysmith, is used for the next 30 years to celebrate what appears to be a CIA killing. The other killings on the East Bay, in Lake Berryessa, in Lake Herman Road, in Benicia / outside the city limit of Vallejo, and at Blue Rock Springs, which is in the city limit of Vallejo on Columbus Parkway. Those 3 incidents, which killed a grand total of 4 people. Let's see, 2, 4. Yeah, it killed 4. 4 people and wounded 2 men, boys. Those are all close proximity to Arthur Lee Allen's home and close proximity to where Don Cheney could assist. Plus, they found a wing walker shoe print at Lake Berryessa, which is the furthest of all the murder scenes, but it was by knife, and it does not fit the pattern of the Zodiac killings at all. It doesn't even fit the pattern of the Sharon Tate killings. Well, it could if they were M7 bayonet wounds, but we don't have the autopsy report on that, so I can't really say that it was the M7. It could have been. It could have been. It could have been. It was in September 1969, right? That's right after the Sharon Tate murder. So that would make sense. If it turns out we found that it was an M7 bayonet that stabbed Cecilia, forgot her last name. If it was an M7, then you know it's CIA. It's totally CIA if it's an M7. So it possibly was, but that might exclude that could exclude Don Chaney and exclude Arthur Lee Allen, because they were kind of losers. They weren't professional soldiers. One was in the Air Force, Don Chaney, and one was in the United States Navy with a dishonorable discharge, and they were known as F-ups. So Don Chaney did wear like a size 12 shoe, and there was a size 12 wingwalker footprint found at the parking area where the Carmen Gia was found at Lake Berryessa. So that sort of maybe means that maybe Don Chaney was there as the lookout, but I don't know. And I really would like to know what the wound patterns look like on the two victims there, and I'd never been able to get that information. And neither did Robert Graysmith. He didn't get that information either, because, see, they don't want you to know. This is why they introduced the Ronald Reagan buntline pistol, to create in your mind that a pistol was used. No, a rifle was used at Cielo Drive. M16 rifles were used. Rifles, plural, many rifles, probably a dozen. And several of the rifles were discharged, but most of the rifles were just used to attach to the bayonet to stab people. That's really the only purpose of the rifle, was to use the bayonet, not to shoot anyone. But there were 7 bullets that were discharged at the Sharon Tate murder scene. Okay? So this is what they do. They introduce weapons that weren't used in the murder to divert your attention away from what really happened. And they did a Charlie Manson case by admitting a buck knife, which was never used. And they introduced the Ronald Reagan pistol, which was never used. And these books that Robert Greystone is writing, he's a diversion. Just like all the other Charlie Manson mendacity, Ed Sanders, Neil Sanders, Nicholas Schreck, Tom O'Neill. His book is the least worst of all of them, because he does discuss the CIA operations at Haight Ashbury, but he doesn't go anywhere near material witnesses. He doesn't go anywhere near Doris Day. He doesn't go anywhere near Brian Wilson. He doesn't go anywhere near Diane Linklater's murder. He doesn't go anywhere near Art Linklater. He doesn't go anywhere near Ronald Reagan. He doesn't go anywhere near the key players in Benedict Canyon. Doesn't go anywhere near the comings and goings of the Jean Harlow. Her husband was murdered, walking distance from that. He doesn't go anywhere near Doris Duke, who lived 550 feet away. He doesn't go anywhere near the Doppelganger twin home and the 6 homes right around the murder scene of Sharon Tate. He doesn't go anywhere near that. He doesn't go anywhere near discussions of the murder weapons used. He doesn't discuss the murders. So his book is a diversion in that he sort of loosely says he doesn't believe in the official story, but that Charlie Manson deserves to be in prison. Well, that disqualifies Tom O'Neill as being a credible person. I mean, he's a waiter who wrote gossip columns. That was his training before he wrote his, Charles Manson, the 1960s and the CIA book, which is a mendacity, just another mendacity, because of his FOIA searches that he tells us what we already sort of know, that we already know that Charlie Manson was not supervised by his parole officers, but he was supervised at all times. And he never murdered anyone. And there's no evidence that he murdered anyone at all. And there's no evidence that Susan Atkins murdered anyone at all. And Tom O'Neill spends no time going into the fact that they were all scapegoats. He doesn't say they're scapegoats. He just says he doesn't believe the official story. Well, you have to be sort of, mind controlled to not get your own research. All right, that's it for today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.